when your grown children come home. 6 words that stopped Steve Harvey mid-sentence and transformed a game show studio into something sacred. 6 words that came from the mouth of a 52-year-old woman who had spent the last 3 years learning that being a mother doesn't end when your children become adults. It just becomes more complicated, more heartbreaking, and somehow more beautiful. But this story doesn't begin with those 6 words. It begins 18 months earlier in a kitchen in suburban Cleveland, where Margaret Wilson sat alone at a table set for 5, staring at the empty chairs that had once been filled with the laughter, arguments, and chaos of family dinners that she had once taken for granted. Margaret had been a mother for 28 years. It had been her identity, her purpose, her North Star through every decision she'd made since her oldest daughter Emma was born. She had been the mom who volunteered for every school event, who knew every teacher's name, who turned their suburban home into the neighborhood gathering place where all the kids felt welcome and fed. She had been the mom who packed lunches with handwritten notes until her youngest graduated high school. The mom who attended every soccer game, every school play, every graduation ceremony, with a camera and tears of pride. The mom who had given everything she had to raising 3 remarkable human beings. Emma, now 26 and living in Seattle as a software engineer, Michael, 24 and stationed overseas with the Marines, and Sarah, 22 and finishing her master's degree in Chicago. The transformation from full house to empty nest had been gradual but devastating. First, Emma had left for college, then graduate school, then her job across the country. Michael had joined the military straight out of high school, choosing duty and adventure over staying close to home. Sarah, the baby, had been the last to leave, and her departure had hit Margaret like a physical blow. Margaret had done everything right. She had raised independent, successful, kind adults who were living their own lives, pursuing their own dreams, building their own futures. This was supposed to be the victory lap, the moment when she could look back with satisfaction at a job well done. Instead, she felt lost. The empty nest syndrome had hit Margaret harder than she'd ever anticipated. She had read about it, intellectually understood it, even counseled friends through it. But experiencing it was different. The silence in her house was deafening. The lack of chaos felt like death. The freedom she had once dreamed of felt like abandonment. Margaret found herself wandering through her house, touching objects that held memories. Emma's debate trophy from high school, Michael's baseball glove, still broken imperfectly from years of catch in the backyard, Sarah's art projects that still decorated the refrigerator. The house felt like a museum to a life that was over. But the emptiness wasn't just about missing her children's physical presence. It was about feeling forgotten by them. Phone calls that came once a week if she was lucky. Usually rushed conversations squeezed between work meetings and social plans. Text messages that went unanswered for days. Holidays that required negotiations and compromises, dividing time between her family and their partners' families. Grandchildren that she saw through video calls more often than in person. Margaret's marriage to her husband David had also been strained by this transition. After 25 years together, they had realized they had spent so much time being parents that they had forgotten how to be partners. Their conversations revolved around logistics and schedules that no longer existed. Their shared purpose had been raising children who no longer needed raising. David was struggling, too. Early retirement from his engineering position had left him feeling directionless. At 54, he felt too young to be done working, but too old to start over. The house that had once bustled with activity now felt oppressively quiet. He and Margaret moved around each other like polite strangers, each dealing with their losses separately. The breaking point had come 6 months before their Family Feud appearance. During what was supposed to be a pleasant family video call, Sarah had casually mentioned that she was spending Thanksgiving with her boyfriend's family. "But we always do Thanksgiving together," Margaret had said, trying to keep the hurt out of her voice. "Mom, I'm 22. I can't always come running home for every holiday," Sarah had replied, her tone carrying the impatience of a young adult who felt her independence was being questioned. I'm not asking you to come running. I'm asking you to come home. There's a difference. The conversation had escalated quickly. Sarah accusing Margaret of guilt-tripping her. Margaret feeling like she was being punished for raising independent children. Emma and Michael, joining the video call from their respective locations, had tried to mediate but ended up taking sides. "Mom, you need to let us be adults," Emma had said, her voice gentle but firm. "We love you, but we have our own lives now." "I know you have your own lives," Margaret had replied, her voice breaking, "but I thought I was still part of them." The call had ended with harsh words and hurt feelings on all sides. The unified front of her children against her had been devastating. Margaret had spent weeks replaying the conversation, wondering when she had become the villain in her children's stories, instead of the hero she had always tried to be. In the months that followed, the distance had grown. Phone calls became even less frequent. Holiday plans were made around everyone else's schedules. Margaret felt like an afterthought in the lives of the people she had dedicated her entire adult life to raising. David had tried to comfort her, but he was dealing with his own identity crisis. "Maybe we need to find new dreams," David had suggested one evening, as they sat in their quiet living room, the silence punctuated only by the ticking of the grandfather clock that Margaret had insisted they buy when the kids were little. "I don't want new dreams," Margaret had replied. "I want my old dreams back. I want Sunday dinners and game nights and voices in this house again." The suggestion from their pastor to consider counseling had been met with resistance from both of them. Neither wanted to admit that their family was struggling. They had been the family other people looked up to, the parents who seemed to have it all figured out. The idea that they might need help felt like admitting failure. The Family Feud audition had been David's idea, born from desperation as much as hope. He'd found the application online during one of his sleepless nights, scrolling through his phone while Margaret slept fitfully beside him. The idea of doing something together, something that might bring joy back into their relationship, had appealed to him. Under "Why Should Your Family Be Chosen?" he had written, "Because we're learning that families don't shrink when children grow up, they expand. We want to show America what it looks like when empty nesters discover that love doesn't have an expiration date, and that the best families are the ones that choose to keep growing together even when everything changes." Margaret had been skeptical about the whole thing. The idea of being on national television, competing in games, pretending to be a happy family when their actual family felt fragmented and distant, seemed like an exercise in public humiliation. What if their dysfunction was obvious to everyone watching? What if the children refused to participate? What if they made fools of themselves on national television? But something had changed when they received the acceptance call. For the first time in months, Margaret had felt excited about something. The producer had explained that they would be featuring families with interesting dynamics, families that represented the complexity of modern American life. More importantly, when she called to tell the children about their Family Feud appearance, all three of them had been genuinely enthusiastic. "Mom, that's amazing," Emma had said, her voice carrying a warmth that Margaret hadn't heard in months. "I'm so proud of you guys for doing something fun together. This is going to be incredible." Michael had managed to get leave approved so he could be there in person. "Wouldn't miss it, Ma," he had said, using the childhood nickname that he'd abandoned in recent years. "The Wilson family is going to dominate that game." Sarah had rearranged her class schedule and found a cheap flight to fly in from Chicago. "I can't wait," she had said, and for the first time in months, Margaret had heard genuine excitement in her youngest daughter's voice. Suddenly, for the first time in over a year, the entire Wilson family was going to be in the same place at the same time. Not for an obligation or a guilt trip, but for something fun they were doing together. But Margaret had been nervous about how it would work. Would the children feel obligated to be there? Would the old tensions resurface under the pressure of television cameras? Would they be able to function as a team, or would their disconnection be obvious to everyone watching? The night before the taping, the entire family had gathered at Margaret and David's house for a practice session and dinner. It was the first time they had all been together since the previous Christmas, which had been strained and awkward. Margaret had spent hours preparing their favorite meal, David's pot roast, Emma's garlic mashed potatoes, Michael's green bean casserole, and Sarah's chocolate chip cookies. As she cooked, she had found herself crying periodically, overwhelmed by the simple joy of cooking for her whole family again. The day of the taping, those fears had evaporated almost immediately. Something magical happened when the Wilson family gathered in the Family Feud waiting area. Emma, Michael, and Sarah had reverted to their childhood roles, teasing each other, sharing inside jokes, competing for who could make their parents laugh the loudest. Margaret had watched her children interact with each other and felt a rush of recognition. These were her kids, not the distant, busy adults who rarely called. These were Emma, Michael, and Sarah Wilson, who had once spent entire Saturday mornings building blanket forts and staging elaborate plays in their living room. Emma was still the organizer, making sure everyone knew their roles and strategies. Michael was still the comedian, keeping everyone relaxed with his quick wit and military stories. Sarah was still the diplomat, making sure everyone felt included and valued. When Steve Harvey had called them onto the stage for the family introduction, Margaret had felt nervous for different reasons. Not because she was worried about their family dynamic, but because she didn't want this moment to end. Standing there with her husband and her 3 children, all of them wearing matching blue shirts and genuine smiles, she felt like herself again for the first time in years. And here we have the Wilson family from Cleveland, Ohio, Steve had announced with his signature enthusiasm. "Tell me about your family, Margaret." Margaret had stepped forward, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "We're here because our kids are amazing human beings who have taught us that growing up doesn't mean growing apart. Even when they're scattered across the country pursuing their dreams, they're still the best part of our lives." Emma had squeezed Margaret's hand. Michael had put his arm around her shoulders. Sarah had looked at her with the kind of love and pride that Margaret had been afraid she'd lost forever. Steve had looked at the 3 adult children, all clearly in their 20s, all radiating success and independence. "And what brings you all back together for Family Feud?" Sarah had answered without hesitation. "Because when your parents call and ask you to be on a game show with them, you say yes. No matter how old you get, no matter where you live, no matter what else is going on in your life, this is still home. These are still the people who matter most." The game had progressed beautifully. The Wilson family had played with the kind of chemistry that comes from years of shared jokes, common references, and deep affection. They were competitive against the Morrison family from Texas, but more than that, they were joyful. Emma had nailed several answers with her quick thinking and analytical mind. Michael had brought his military precision to strategy while making everyone laugh with his dry humor. Sarah had surprised everyone, including herself, with answers that seemed to come from nowhere but landed perfectly on the board. Margaret had contributed solid answers throughout, but more than that, she had watched her family function as a unit again. She had seen Emma defer to Michael's military experience when a question came up about leadership. She had watched Michael step back to let Sarah shine when a question played to her strengths and social dynamics. She had observed all 3 of her children celebrate not just their own successes, but their parents' contributions to the team. But it was during the 4th round that everything shifted. The category was "Name Something That Makes You Feel Young Again." The Morrison family had just played their turn with answers like dancing, listening to old music, and playing with grandchildren. Standard answers that had earned them decent points, but nothing spectacular. It was Margaret's turn at the podium. Throughout the game, she had been solid but not spectacular, contributing good answers that helped her family score but didn't necessarily stand out. But now, facing this particular question, something changed in her expression. She wasn't just a contestant anymore. She was a mother who had spent 3 years learning that the hardest part of parenting isn't raising children, it's learning to love them as adults, while giving them the space to become who they're meant to be. "Margaret," Steve said, For the points your family needs, name something that makes you feel young again. Margaret looked out at the studio audience, then back at her family standing behind her, then directly at Steve. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying across the studio with the weight of lived experience and hard-won wisdom. When your grown children come home, the words landed in the studio like a revelation. Steve's expression changed immediately. The entertainer's mask slipped away, revealing the grandfather and father underneath. He understood instantly that this wasn't just a game show answer. This was a truth that resonated in the bones of every parent who had ever watched their children leave and hoped they would choose to return. "Margaret," Steve said gently, taking a step closer to her podium. "That's not just an answer. That's poetry." The board revealed that it wasn't there. The survey hadn't captured something so specific, so personal, so true. But something profound had shifted in the studio. The audience wasn't thinking about points anymore. The Morrison family wasn't focused on winning. Everyone was looking at Margaret, who was crying now, and at her 3 adult children, who were crying too. "Tell me about it," Steve said. And it wasn't a request from a host to a contestant. It was an invitation from one parent to another. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked at her children. "I spent 28 years being their mom every single day. And then suddenly, I wasn't anymore. Not in the same way. They didn't need me to pack their lunches or drive them to practice or help with homework. They were adults with their own lives, their own problems, their own joys that they didn't always share with me." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "For the last 3 years, I felt like I was mourning something. Not my children, they're alive and healthy and successful, but my role in their lives. I thought being a good mother meant raising independent kids who didn't need me anymore. What I didn't realize was how much I would need them." Steve walked closer to Margaret, his attention completely focused on her story. "And then," Margaret continued, "we got chosen for this show. And for the first time in years, all 3 of my children said yes to spending time with me. Not because they had to, not because it was a holiday or an obligation, but because they wanted to." She turned to look at Emma, Michael, and Sarah, who were now openly crying. "When they walked into our house yesterday to practice for today's show, I felt like myself again, not like an empty nester or a woman trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. I felt like their mom, and more than that, I felt like they still wanted me to be their mom." That's when Steve Harvey did something unprecedented in Family Feud history. He walked away from his host position entirely, went directly to the Wilson family area, and gathered all 4 family members, Margaret, David, Emma, Michael, and Sarah, into a group embrace. "Y'all listen to me," Steve said, his voice carrying across the studio with unusual gravity. "This right here, this is what matters. Not the points, not the money, not the prizes. This." The studio audience rose to their feet, not because they were prompted to, but because they recognized something sacred happening in front of them. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a family remembering how to love each other across the distances that life creates. Steve addressed the studio and the cameras directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just learned something more important than any survey could teach us. We learned that growing up doesn't mean growing apart. That being independent doesn't mean being disconnected. That the best families aren't the ones that never change. They're the ones that choose to keep choosing each other through all the changes." But Steve wasn't finished. He turned to the Morrison family, who had been watching this unfold with tears in their own eyes. "Morrison family," Steve said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Would it be all right with you if we called this game a tie? Because what happened here today isn't about winning or losing. It's about understanding what we just learned from this beautiful family." Mrs. Morrison, a mother of 4 herself, stepped forward without hesitation. "Steve, it would be our honor. Some things are more important than points." What happened next had never occurred in Family Feud history. Both families gathered at center stage together, not as competitors, but as witnesses to something profound. The Wilson children surrounded their parents, and Margaret found herself at the center of a love that felt both familiar and lately discovered. Steve addressed everyone one final time. "Margaret, you said something today that I want every parent watching to hear. You said that you thought being a good mother meant raising independent kids who didn't need you anymore. But here's what your children just showed America. Independence doesn't mean they don't need you. It means they choose you." Emma stepped forward first. "Mom," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like I didn't want to be your daughter anymore. Living far away doesn't mean I love you less. It just means I carry your love with me wherever I go." Michael, still in his dress blues, spoke next. "Ma, you raised us to be strong enough to leave home. But you also raised us to be smart enough to know where home is." Sarah, the youngest, who had started the family conflict 18 months ago, took her mother's hands. "Mom, I want to spend Thanksgiving at home this year, and Christmas, and every holiday where you'll have us." Because Emma's right. Independence isn't about not needing you. It's about choosing to need you. The episode aired exactly as it happened, unedited, 6 weeks later. It became one of the highest-rate Family Feud episodes in the show's history. Not because of dramatic television, but because viewers recognized something authentic in a world that often feels disconnected. More importantly, it sparked conversations about family dynamics, empty nest syndrome, and the challenges of maintaining relationships across generational and geographical distances. Parenting magazines featured articles about the Wilson moment. Family therapists used Margaret's story as a case study in healthy family evolution. Margaret Wilson returned to Cleveland with more than game show memories. She returned with a renewed relationship with her children and a different understanding of what it means to be a mother to adults. The weekly phone calls became daily text threads. The obligatory holiday visits became anticipated family gatherings. The family established new traditions that honored both independence and connection. Sunday video calls became sacred time when everyone shared their week's highlights and challenges. The annual family vacation was reinstated, with destinations chosen democratically and everyone contributing according to their means and circumstances. David and Margaret also rediscovered each other as partners rather than just co-parents. They began taking weekend trips together, exploring interests they had set aside during the intensive parenting years. They learned to have conversations that weren't about their children's schedules or needs, remembering who they had been before they became parents, and who they could be now. But perhaps most importantly, Margaret learned something that she now shares with other empty nest parents: that the goal isn't to stop being needed by your children. The goal is to be needed in new ways, to be chosen rather than obligated, to be wanted rather than required. Margaret began volunteering with a local organization that supports families through transitions. She facilitates support groups for empty nest parents, sharing her story and helping others navigate the complex emotions of watching their children become independent adults. Her advice is always the same: create a home so full of love that your adult children choose to return to it. Today, the Wilson family gathers for dinner every Sunday when everyone is in town. They play board games, share stories about their week, and laugh at the same jokes they've been telling for decades. When the children can't be there in person, they join by video call, making sure their faces are part of the family table. Emma has since moved back to Cleveland, accepting a position with a tech company that allows her to work remotely part of the time. She says being close to family became more important than career advancement once she realized how much she had missed the daily connection with her parents. Michael completed his military service and now works for a defense contractor in nearby Akron. He brings his girlfriend to family dinners, and Margaret has learned to love watching him build his own family while staying connected to his original one. Sarah finished her master's degree and took a job in Columbus, close enough for weekend visits. She often brings homework to family dinners, spreading her papers across the same kitchen table where Margaret once helped her with elementary school math problems. Margaret still misses the daily chaos of active parenting, but she no longer mourns it. Instead, she celebrates the deeper, more intentional relationships she has with Emma, Michael, and Sarah. She has learned that empty nest doesn't mean empty heart. It means making room for new kinds of love. The answer Margaret gave that day never made it onto the board, but it made it into the hearts of millions of parents who understood that some truths are too important for surveys, too personal for points, and too powerful for anything except the kind of love that chooses to keep growing even when everything else changes. When your grown children come home. 6 words that capture the essence of what it means to be a parent in the modern world. Not someone who controls or demands, but someone who creates a place so full of love that adult children choose to return to it again and again, not because they have to, but because they want to. That's what Margaret Wilson taught America that day. That's what her children taught her. That's what family really means when it's working the way it's supposed to work. When love expands rather than contracts. When growing up means growing closer rather than growing apart. When home becomes not just where you came from, but where you choose to return.